Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. As you can tell from the title, we're going to be talking about Wes Huff, someone I just became familiar with more recently. I know he does a lot of great work. He's a great apologist. In fact, many of the guys, as you well know, that I confront as far as their Calvinistic theology or their Reformed theology, I have a great amount of respect for, and it's not about them personally, it's about their beliefs. And you can disagree with people without being overly disagreeable. You can be respectful to people you disagree with. And that's really this channel's purpose, is to help people to see where we believe Calvinists have misled the church and where we believe Calvinists have wrongly interpreted certain passages. Now, is Wes a Reformed Calvinist or not? We're going to get into that. He self-proclaims as Reformed, as we will see. We'll talk about this. And you'll hear a clip of him speaking, answering some questions that kind of indicate where he stands on this issue. And we're going to kind of dive into that as we've done historically on this program by playing people in their own words, listening to them, let them explain themselves. I don't want to put words in Wes's mouth. I don't want to misrepresent him. That's never my goal, to misrepresent anyone. I want them to speak for themselves. And then I want to engage with what they're talking about. Before I jump into this, let me remind you, as what is scrolling on the bottom of the screen, we are a listener-supported ministry, and we appreciate those who give on a regular basis to make this happen, those who make one-time donations, those who've downloaded the app and leave 5-star reviews there for Libsyn and iTunes and here on YouTube. When you like and share this, it helps so much, and we really appreciate that. Also, remember, I am a full-time professor of theology at Trinity Seminary. You can go to trinitysem.edu to learn more about the other things I teach about. If you don't want to hear just about soteriology, then don't come to just my soteriology page. Go join Trinity and be one of my students in one of my classes and hear me talk about other things if you would like. So this material, though, is all free for you, and you have to pay to go to seminary. And so I'm providing this for you. And so hopefully it is helpful and edifying, and hopefully it helps you to engage with what leading, good, smart, Reformed folks believe and teach. And I say that knowing full well that Wes could run circles around me in so many other theological topics and so many other historical things that he has studied in. He's an impressive young guy. I assume he's younger than me. He looks half my age. He's an impressive young man. He does a great job in his interview with Joe Rogan, and on this podcast, he does a great job as well. And so I have no ill will towards Wes whatsoever. I say, keep doing what you're doing, brother, if he happens to ever see this. I'm praying for you. I think that you're a otherwise great apologist and minister, so keep doing what you're doing. I want you to do that. However, I've also sent out messages in the universe to say I would love to have a conversation with Wes. I am sure he would be a great conversationalist and unpack some of these specifics and what he means by what he says in certain aspects. Now, how did I learn about Wes and how did this all come up? Well, let me give you a little background. I get messages from friends and listeners all the time that basically are saying, hey, will you engage this? Or will you talk about this? Or what do you think about this book? Or what do you think about this church? Or what do you think about this pastor? Or what do you think? Or here's a clip. What do you think about that? I get those messages every week, at least 1 or 2 or 3 times a week. Okay. And I can't engage with them all. I want to. In fact, I have some people make jokes or even say, how do you have enough material? You know, don't you run out of material? I'm like, if you only knew and you saw my inbox of the amount of material that I have waiting for me, the mountain of material that I have waiting for me to actually cover, you would know full well that you can most certainly dedicate to a specific topic and have more than enough information to discuss. And this was one of them that was sent to me a while back. And I was walking, I believe, when it was sent to me. And so I just opened it up and started listening to this clip. And one, I was really impressed with Wes's demeanor, his knowledge. In fact, I didn't have a lot to disagree with. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not sure why my friend sent me this, because he doesn't really sound all that Calvinistic. I mean, you can kind of take some of what he says as a little bit Calvinistic, but a lot of what he says I could kind of sign off on if I understand it from one perspective or another. It's not much of an issue. And so I didn't think much of it. And I just kind of think, yeah, he's doing a good job. I don't see anything that worth really engaging there. And we're going to hear it. You're going to listen to what he has to say. And there's a few points I can parse out, of course. But But Wes is probably representing the type of Reformed guys that I'm really used to engaging with in my own Southern Baptist world, that are somewhat Reformed by name only, or have some very inconsistent beliefs within their Reformed theological framework, if that makes sense. And again, we'll unpack some of that as we go through it. I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through it. But I even wrote an article years ago called The Nominal Calvinist, Calvinist by name only, where they affirm certain aspects of Calvinism while denying all the controversial parts. And I suspect, I don't know, I can't put words in Wes's mouth, that he falls somewhere in that realm. I could be wrong. That's why I want to have a conversation with him. I don't really know where and how he would answer some of these questions, and that's why I wanted to engage this. But the reason that I came to the conclusion, or I excited to do this, was because a tweet came up on X that kind of indicated pretty obviously where Wes stood. He even says it there, it's on the screen. He says, so apparently some people are surprised and or think it's controversial that I'm Reformed. Shouldn't be. Anyone familiar with historic Reformed Protestantism should clearly see that my academic, theological, evangelistic, and apologetic methodology and motivation all stems from the particular heritage that I stand within. One might, I add, thoroughly and completely rooted in Scripture itself as a motivating principle and director. And he goes on to give a kind of a screenshot from something on his website. We're going to go over that towards the end of this, where I'm going to engage with some actual Calvinistic Reformed sounding points from that image. But I'm going to save that because I want you to hear him talk first, because I think he's impressive when he gives these answers to these guys. And all these guys that he's talking to aren't necessarily Christians. I think one of them is a well-known comedian, and they're just having really good conversations. And I love the fact that he has a stage and that he's able to engage with and to talk to these guys about God and about theology and about Jesus. And that just delights my heart. And I want to encourage Wes, keep doing what you're doing. And that may be one of the reasons he doesn't ever want to engage with someone like myself in these kinds of conversations, because he sees it as a distraction from the other work he's doing. God bless him. Doesn't hurt my feelings whatsoever. That's fine with me. But if he ever wants to have an engagement or a conversation, take an hour or two out of his day to talk with me about this, he's more than welcome. He has a standing invitation for those that know and like Wes and want to hear from him. I would love to have a conversation with him and talk through some of these issues. But let's listen now to Wes as he's answering a question that's a very controversial question. Matter of fact, it's a question you'll recognize because you and I have gone through it, those who've listened to my program for some time, back when Dr. White and I engaged with this issue and have some differences of opinion. In fact, Wes has some difference of opinion from Dr. White, as you'll hear. So let's play this. Let me know sound-wise if it's coming through okay.
What would you say in the case of children that die on the first day of life, or someone with like a cognitive disability where they're not able to function in society or have any type of like intellectual understanding of Christ? What happens to them?
Yeah, I would say everybody is born with original sin and we all deserve punishment. But from who I know God's character to be in Scripture, God is free to save whom he wants to save. And based on...
Okay, so let's stop there. Obviously, we would have some issues with inherited guilt, and he does seem to affirm the typical Calvinistic version of original guilt, where we all deserve punishment from birth. I even held to that view as a provisionist for a time until Adam Harwood's work convinced me to leave behind not original sin in total, but the concept of original guilt, and to hold to more of what is referred to as conditional imputation. In other words, the guilt is imputed to you when you sin, when you reach an age where you're actually able to sin as a cognitive adult human being that can make cognitive reasoning, that can choose reasonably, an age of accountability, if you will. And you're imputed with the guilt that Adam represents as sinful humanity. In other words, you're not born condemned in the sense that you're born being needed to be punished because you haven't done anything wrong yet. Okay, you're innocent, as even Wes will say later, as MacArthur has said and other things. And so why he says they should be punished, I don't really know. I think it's probably based upon a misreading of Romans 5, which we've gone over. I go over it in my book, Drawn by Jesus. I dedicate a whole chapter to this, in fact. And so I deny original guilt, just like, matter of fact, Ulrich Zwingli, a reformer, denied original guilt. Okay, matter of fact, Luther called him a Pelagian because he denied original guilt. He also held to more of a conditional imputation, just like you're conditionally imputed with the righteousness of Christ when you have faith. So too, you're conditionally imputed with the guilt of Adam when you actually sin. I think that's more in line with the congruence of what Romans 5 is talking about than the concept of a mistranslation from the Latin that introduced by Augustine in the 5th century. And that's just my opinion on that. There are some provisionists who disagree with me on that. There are some Calvinists, obviously, who disagree. And so that's one of those issues that doesn't necessarily land him in the Calvinist camp. It's just a typical Calvinistic doctrine from which flows, I think, some other more serious errors. Because when you hold to original guilt, you have to deal with some other things. And you also have some Calvinists who are higher in their Calvinism, like Dr. White would be, who says things like, well, I believe God elects to save some infants and others not so much. And therefore you have elect infant damnation, in the sense that God elects for some infants to be damned for what? The imputed guilt of someone else that was born before they were ever created. So those kinds of things are very controversial. Obviously, we get into those kinds of things more in depth in other programs. But that's one of the areas that I would differ with Wes, but it doesn't necessarily make him uniquely Calvinistic to hold to that view. There are some people who have differing views of imputed guilt, but that the cross took care of that. And so some people would argue from our perspective that universally the cross took care of that imputed guilt, and therefore they're not guilty because of the cross, things like that. There's all different kinds of views on this, folks. In fact, when people act like there's only one view and it's the only orthodox view in all of history, they just reveal themselves as ignorant of the topic. And I'm not saying Wes is that way. I'm sure Wes, being a historian, probably knows there are other views. In fact, he's very humble in this conversation with these folks, and he even admits, this is just my opinion about some things. This is my view. There's some people who hold different views. And so I appreciate that about him as well. Let's move on.
Based on who God is, I see no reason why he would not save children who die in infancy. Mm-hmm. He would not save people with cognitive disabilities. I don't know the answer to that ultimately, but once again, like, Scripture tells us what we need to know, not what we want to know. But I think based on the character of God and the fact that when the Israelites are told not to sacrifice their children, it's the only time that like a group is overtly described as the innocent, like the death of the innocents is what it's described.
Okay, so this is where it seems incongruent, a little bit controversial to talk about these people, babies, are innocent. But then earlier he said that they're to be punished. And that doesn't make sense, to punish the innocent. The Bible is replete with of teachings of you're not to punish the innocent. And so there's no reason to punish someone who's innocent. So to call them innocent and to say that they deserve punishment it's just not congruent. It doesn't match up. And it seems to be kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth, which is what we accuse MacArthur of doing as well. So he stands in good company as far as his view on this, because there's a lot of Calvinists who make this incongruent argument that, yes, God, because of his character, his good nature, saves the innocent babies, but they also affirm original guilt, that these babies are born deserving punishment for some reason, this inherited guilt from Adam. And I think, again, it's based upon a misinterpretation of Romans 5, rooted in Augustine's mistranslation of the Latin text.
Described to when these people are sacrificing their children to the pagan agricultural gods. So I think it's like extrapolating and it's conjecture, but I think based on what I see in Scripture of who God is, that he's loving, that he's compassionate, that he's merciful, that he's abounding in steadfast love and kindness, right? That Exodus 34:6, that I see no reason to not say that if my wife has a miscarriage, that child I will be reunited with in heaven, mm-hmm. because of who God is and what his loving kindness is.
Okay, so notice Wes is defending the same thing we're defending, the goodness and the character of God, because he sees, and we agree, that it would be demonstrably evil for God to choose to punish, especially in a place like hell, for eternity, a miscarried baby or an aborted baby or an infant that dies, or someone with a cognitive disability. We just all intuitively know that would be wrong. Yet Dr. White and other Calvinists to say, well, God's free to save who he wants to save. And if he wants to damn an infant that dies in the womb, who are you to question God? And that, yes, is a more consistent Calvinistic view, but it's very inconsistent with the character revealed through Christ. And that's what Wes, I think, is recognizing. And so I appreciate the fact that Wes, even as a Calvinist, is holding to something that I consider to be very incongruent with Calvinism, very inconsistent with the claims of Calvinists in general, which is why I think Dr. White holds to the view he holds to. He sees the inconsistency. He knows why it's inconsistent in cross-examination for him to hold to the same view that MacArthur and Piper and Wes hold to. But I would rather have an inconsistent Calvinist any day on this topic, because think of the damage Wes would have done if he would have told these unbelievers and the audience of unbelievers watching him, yeah, God might condemn infants. That's just horrible. Not only horrible for evangelism, but just horrible in the representation of who our God is. And so thank God for inconsistent Calvinism when it comes to things like this. And again, I'm not exactly sure Wes stands on all this. So I'm speculating based upon some of the things that we learn and that we'll look at.
To humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So couldn't you extrapolate that to the guy on the island?
That's
Okay, what an awesome question. I think this guy, I don't know this guy personally. I think he's a comedian and obviously a good thinker, because immediately his answer is, well, wouldn't that apply to the guy on the island? What's he talking about? The guy because earlier they had talked about that. What about the people who've never heard the gospel? Wouldn't God be, if this God you believe in is so compassionate and loving, why wouldn't he be just as compassionate to the guy on the island who doesn't know who Jesus is as he would be to an infant who dies? Aren't they kind of in the same boat? They're both unable to believe for different reasons. So why wouldn't the God you're talking about, who has this character of love and compassion, be just as kind and loving to a 28-year-old as he is to an 8-month-old who dies when they're both completely incapable? Let's pause for a second. Let's go back to the debate I had with James White over this issue and the book I wrote on the topic, Drawn by Jesus. Out of the chapter of that, I quoted from Seth Dillon, who was the CEO of the Babylon Bee. Many of you are familiar with Seth Dillon. He's been on the program before. When we were going on Twitter back and forth, Dr. White and I, on this issue of infant damnation, and Dr. White's view that God elects to save some infants and not others, and that's his prerogative. Seth wrote this. He says, if Calvinism is true, I struggle to see much of a moral distinction between infants and adults. Neither of them meets the conditions for moral accountability. Do you hear what Seth is arguing? In other words, on Calvinism, both the infant that dies in the womb and the reprobate, the person who's never been regenerated, both of them do not meet the conditions of moral accountability. Why? Because neither one of them are morally accountable. Neither one of them are able to give account for their moral choices on either view when you really think about it. Notice what he says, quote, the former, speaking of infants, are incapable of sinning. The latter are incapable of doing anything other than what they were predetermined to want to do. They are instruments, not real agents. Treating them as agents and holding them accountable for their actions is just as absurd and nonsensical as treating babies as if they're guilty of wrongdoing. Do you see what Seth is arguing? Seth is basically saying if total inability is true, i.e., by God's design, by God's decree, babies are all of us are born with this moral incapacity to understand and believe the gospel, unless we were picked before we were born and caused to do through some irresistible grace. If that's true, then I don't see how an infant that dies in the womb is any more accountable than the 80-year-old who dies his entire life with this moral incapacity that he was born with, that he has no control over. Why do you think God's more gracious to the little one and not the old one, when both of them are just as incapable? How is that loving and gracious of God? How does that defend God's character to do that? Do you see the difference? Now, if I were answering this brother's question with regard to the person out on the island, you might say, well, how do you answer that question? Well, the book, God's Provision for All, which I have videos on as well. You can go and you look at Soteriology 101 and type in, what about the unevangelized or those who never hear? And I've got articles there for free as well. So it's not just about selling books. I've got videos on it for free. You can go watch this. I answer this question many, many times. and we go over the differing views, the restrictivist views, the inclusivist views, and the different perspectives. And what we argue is that one is held accountable for the level and light of revelation they've been given. And that those who are faithful with a little amount of light of revelation, God will entrust them with more light. He'll bring more light, more revelation to those who need it, and to those who he knows would accept it based upon the light and revelation they've been given. Now, there are some questions about that topic. We get into it in other places where I go more in depth, because some of you I know are going, okay, what about this? What about that? I know. Trust me, I've dealt with all of those questions in other broadcasts. We're not going to take the time to do that. But that's the kind of answer I would have given this brother, because I would believe that the man on the island who's never heard the specific news of Jesus Christ has heard sufficiently and seen sufficiently through general light and revelation in his conscience enough to acknowledge God as God, according to Romans 1:2. And I believe that is why he's accountable. Now, the difference between the Calvinist and my interpretation of Romans 1 and 2 is that I believe the revelation that they get through natural revelation, general revelation, is sufficient to respond to that light and revelation. Now, some people say, well, oh, you think that general revelation is enough to save you? I don't even think special revelation is enough to save you, okay? Because revelation doesn't save you. What does revelation do? It reveals. And you're responsible for what has been revealed to you. You're held accountable for that. Only Christ saves. The question is, who does Christ choose to save based upon the light and revelation they've been given and based upon what he knows of their heart? And we've got to trust God with that judgment. So Rahab, a harlot, who was obviously illiterate, uneducated, female in those ancient days would have certainly, and a harlot no less, would have certainly not ever been educated. She didn't know anything about the God of Israel except that she feared him. She had a level of faith that made the hall of faith in Hebrews 11. Why and how did God know her heart? Only God can judge the person's heart. But she made the hall of faith because she simply feared this distant God of Israel and hid the spies on their behalf, because she feared the God of Israel. God found that sufficient to show her grace. I think God's merciful. I think God's gracious. I think he's looking for opportunities to bring salvation to those who are willing to follow him, who are willing to trust in him. And I think that's the God of Scripture, revealed throughout Scripture. And so we can go over that, and I do go over that in other episodes in much more in depth. But let's go back now to the question he just asked. Remember what it was. How does that not correlate? Your belief that God's good and gracious to those who can't respond because they're infants. Well, what about the guy out on the island who can't respond because he's out on the island and never heard the gospel?
That's what I would. It could be. It could be. However, there is kind of a cognitive reckoning. And this is where I would be careful to say that this is my opinion.
Yeah, we're not.
But I'm not denying that everybody is
not like an
stained with
Orthodox
sin.
Christian bishop or anything like that we would really trust.
Name Andrew Schultz?
Yeah. Go on.
So, but these are like topics that have been discussed for 2,000 plus years, right? The Jews in the pre-Jesus times were also coming up with these questions. So there's a lot of delineation in literature and like debate about these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
one thing scripture that hung me up when I was a kid is the idea of the Pharaoh of Egypt having his heart hardened by God, and that God hardened his heart so that he couldn't see the truth of what was being revealed. Now,
this often happens in these kinds of discussions. Notice Wes never really got to answer the question about the guy on the island. He never went into it. He just referred to the fact that, here's my opinion. There's a lot of different debate over the subject, and then he's kind of interrupted and diverted off to another subject, which just happens in these kinds of conversations. I'm not trying to say he's avoiding anything. I'm sure he's not. That's just the way the conversation goes. But these guys are asking good questions, and this is another good question where he brings up the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. If I remember correctly, it's been a while since I listened to Wes's answer to this, but I don't remember having much issue with his answer. In fact, I remember resonating with much of what Wes said here in answer and reply to this question. Let's listen.
And I'm curious why, in your opinion, God would step in to, I guess, orient him in a way that was against what God wanted.
Yeah, why doesn't he get the same forgiveness?
Yeah, to accomplish God's will. So the thing is,
I guess at that point in time, Jesus hadn't died already.
Yeah, it was Old Testament.
Okay.
Well, God, I would go to the length of saying God knows things we don't, because he's God. And so Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8 and 9, where he comments on this and talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. But It says both.
Which is true. By the way, I'll get copyrighted if I don't interrupt some of the time. So somebody, why do you interrupt so much? It's partly because of that, but partly because I'm long-winded and I like to hear myself talk. Of course, y'all all know that. But he refers to Romans 8 and 9 and talks about the hardening of Pharaoh, which, by the way, is a foreshadowing to the hardening of Israel. The hardening of Pharaoh was to bring about the first Passover. The hardening of the nation of Israel was to bring about the second Passover. In fact, even Calvinistic exegetes draw that parallel, not just Leighton Flowers, okay? And I think it's really important to note that hardening somebody, as we've heard it said, and we've talked about this with other Hebrew scholars, literally means to strengthen someone in their resolve. So someone who is resolved to do a certain thing by their own will, God can strengthen that resolve in order to accomplish a better, greater purpose through their sinful activity. And we believe that God does that through Pharaoh, and we believe that God does that through the nation of Israel, which is why there's an objector in Romans 9. Why are you to blame me, the Israelite, who's been hardened by you? Just like Pharaoh would say, why would you blame me, who was hardened by you? And who are you to question God? Oh man. So it's not a reprobate that was chosen for damnation before they were born that questions Paul. It's a Israelite who, just like Pharaoh, has been hardened by God in his already rebellious, stubborn state in order to bring about the engrafting of the Gentiles and the true Passover. That's the one who's questioning God. That's the interlocutor in the mind of Paul. And when you get that, Calvinism just disappears. And that's what I've been trying to harp on so much in my book, The Potter's Promise. I've harped on it in my debates. I've harped on it on this show so many times that if you understand who the interlocutor is and who he's objecting to, Calvinism has absolutely no apologetic for their theology. And what's so interesting about this, Jonathan Pritchett and others have pointed this out on the program, so interesting about this is that there are Calvinist exegetes who draw this conclusion, but then yet tag at the very end of it, yet still Reformed theology is true somehow. Now, they don't say it exactly that way, but somehow they come to the same conclusions that we do exegetically, but then they just kind of give a tag on the end, but still God's sovereignty, i.e. deterministic theology that we believe in, is still valid in these ways. And we see that in Moo's, Morrison Moo's commentary, for example. I think maybe even Schreiner was using an example where he comes to the exact same conclusion we do. He draws the same exact exegetical conclusions, but then still tags on Calvinism at the end of it without any justification for doing so. Any exegetical reason for doing so. No link in the scripture for saying, therefore, this means Calvinism is true. And so we just draw those kinds of things out. We call that out.
Both that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So there's a mutuality going on in there in God's sovereignty and our free will. Both those things exist. And God uses Pharaoh as a tool to enact his justice. And yet also God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. And so he does these things, even in instances where we might not totally understand what's going on, but it's ultimately for his glorification and the purpose of God is the main character of the story. And the redemption of his people is accomplished through Pharaoh hardening his own heart and being bitter. And yet God also uses that in hardening Pharaoh's hearts to accomplish that narrative. So the book of Genesis literally ends with the story of Joseph, where Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery into Egypt. They want to kill him. God restrains their evil. They sell him into slavery, and he ends up climbing the ranks and being second to Pharaoh. And then there's a famine throughout the land, and the only place that has food, because of the wisdom of Joseph, via the God revealing this to him, is Egypt. And so Joseph's brothers go back to Egypt, and they meet with him, not knowing it's their brother, and eventually he reveals who he is to them. And he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good in the saving of nations. And so God allows evil for good that often we don't understand.
That's all buttering bread on our table, by the way. God uses, he knows, and he uses. Not he sovereignly ordains, he decrees, causes in some way, okay? So God, knowing what the brothers would do, using the brothers' evil ways, even hardening in them in their rebellion, strengthening them in their resolve, just like he does with Pharaoh, is much different than being someone who somehow decrees their nature to be such that they couldn't do otherwise, or whatever other vernacular that you hear the determinists use to try to explain the method and ways in which God brings all things to pass. And we'll get into that a little bit more detail by looking at the image that he presented earlier, because it gets into a little bit more detail on this issue. But remember, when you say God allows, he permits it, that's buttering the bread on the non-Calvinist table, on the non-determinist table, because what is there to allow except what God sovereignly decreed on Calvinism? Because on Calvinism, at least Calvinism proper, God has decreed whatsoever comes to pass. In other words, it comes to pass because God decreed it, not because he knew it was going to happen and chose to allow it or permit it. And that's the kind of language that Wes is using here, which you'll often hear Calvinists. Sproul was one of the worst at this back in the day. When Sproul was talking to unbelievers and having apologetic conversations, he would sound like an Arminian. He used so much of the same kind of free will type of theodicy to defend his worldview when he was talking to non-Calvinists and to unbelievers in general. Why? Because we have a better apologetic, in my opinion. I think our theology is actually practical and works when you're talking to unbelievers, whereas the Calvinistic and more deterministic philosophies fall flat, in my opinion.
Sad.
Mm-hmm.
Wowza.
Karma.
I think
No.
then they start talking about karma. And I love Wes just immediately goes, no. He goes, karma, no. So Wes is really good at engaging with these guys and doing so with wit and humor. And so, Wes, I love you. If you ever watch this, appreciate what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. But we're also going to engage a little bit with what you had said on Twitter, because as I mentioned earlier, he did put out there, he is Reformed. That's his heritage. That's what he was raised in. What does that mean exactly? If y'all remember correctly, even the well-known Arminian Roger Olson has argued that Arminians are of the Reformed tradition. Philip Melanchthon, who is one of the reformers, interpreted Romans 9 much more like the Arminians, and we would interpret it, than like Luther and some of the other Calvinists interpreted it. And so to call somebody Reformed does not necessarily mean soteriologically Calvinistic, because there are many different stripes and types of reformers. And so saying that you're Reformed is really not enough, though that in today's vernacular has become kind of a synonym for Calvinistic soteriology for whatever reasons, for right or wrong. That's kind of the way it's been thought of. And so I think most people put Wes into the more soteriological Calvinistic camp. And the reason I know that is because looking at this image that he did share there on the screen for you, let me make this bigger if I can. I'll switch it to this side over here, do it like this so that you can see that a little bit better. Notice in the top left corner there, it says DOG, referring to the doctrines of grace, which is a catchphrase for Calvinism. All of us believe in doctrines of grace, by the way. And it depends on what do you believe about the doctrines of grace. But this has been nicknamed the doctrines of grace, i.e. Calvinistic theology. And he even has his little logo there right beside the DOG, doctrines of grace. And then he has a quote from Isaiah 46, 8 through 11, with the title God's Sovereignty above it. And then along the side, he has kind of proof texts that refer to these quote unquote Calvinistic doctrines of grace. And so this is where you'll get into a more specific theological view of Wes, because it's not just him talking to a bunch of unbelievers or people struggling, or maybe some new believers, those kinds of things. But he's actually put this on his website as a doctrinal statement. And so usually people are being a lot more precise and careful when they're issuing a doctrinal statement. Even down at the bottom there, it says the Heidelberg Catechism, and that's known to be a Calvinistic catechism. So this is historically Calvinistic, typically Calvinistic language that you wouldn't normally see. That does not mean, however, that if we had a conversation with Wes, that you might hear him defend a lot of his views in the same ways that I would, or explain them a lot of the same ways that I would, and we could then encounter whether we think he's being consistent or not, or whether we think he's really a true Calvinist qua Calvinism, based upon what John Calvin actually taught, or what the leading proponents like Jonathan Edwards or maybe even Jonathan Piper, more modern day Calvinists, would say. And so let's look at this one point at a time and really understand where he's coming from. Try not to misrepresent him. That's not my goal. I want to represent what he's saying by putting his words on the screen and kind of engaging with those words. Okay. The quote is from Isaiah. Many of you are very familiar with this passage. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, your transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God and there is no other. For I am God and there is none like me. We all can affirm that. That's just theism. God is different than anyone else. There's nobody like God. Declaring the end from the beginning. Now, some people have grasped onto that phrase, declaring the end from the beginning, and say, a la determinism. To declare the end from the beginning does not mean that God determines every thought, action, and deed of everything that happens from beginning to end. That is being read into that phrase. That's packing a lot of theology into an otherwise poetic type of phrase that just simply means that God has the ability, as the omniscient one, as the all-powerful one, to bring about his purpose and his plan, the end, from the very beginning. That God is going to bring about his purpose, sometimes despite and even through the sinful choices and actions of libertarianly free creatures. That's the way we would interpret that. The way that the typical determinist Calvinist would interpret that is that God is determining all those things in order to bring about his purposes in the end. And again, there are many different nuances in between those two extremes of the EDD, as we've called it, the extreme determinist versus those who affirm libertarian free will. But declaring the end from the beginning is something that's just commonly held by all Protestants, all theologians for that matter. Of course, God can declare the end from the beginning. He doesn't need to be deterministic to do that. He just needs to be God. And so he doesn't have to determine the molester to molest in order to declare the end from the beginning. In other words, that's just, I think, a truism. Okay. He says, from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. Now, we all agree with that. He will accomplish his purpose. Your sinful actions, thoughts, and deeds will not thwart the purpose of God. Period. End of discussion. We all agree with that. Does that therefore mean God had to be the one who determined all the sinful thoughts and actions that you've ever done in your life or anyone has ever done in life? Of course not. That's a non sequitur. So to say that his purpose will not be thwarted by your sin does not mean that he's somehow the one who brought about your sinful thoughts and actions and deeds. And again, if Wes were here, he might be going, oh, yeah, I would agree with that. That's the way I would say it too. I don't know. He had to speak for himself. Goes on, calling a bird of prey from the east and the man of my counsel from the far country. I have spoken. I will bring it to pass. I have purposed it and I will do it. Again, nothing there that's uniquely Calvinistic at all. Even when you try to pack the only phrase there, declaring the end from the beginning. Now, if it said determining the end from the beginning and everything in between, then the Calvinist would have a really good proof text. But otherwise, it's not saying anything that's uniquely Calvinistic as far as I can tell. But let's look at what's read into these verses based upon some of the verbiage that's used here in this image. The first section there, we'll start there on the left side. Foreknowledge is what the title is. And it says, God knows the future because he plans the future and accomplishes it. Okay, now again, certain phrases and statements can sound fine when you just state them like that and just kind of leave them on the surface level. But what does the future contain? In the future, back in the past, you have molesters, you have Hitler, you have horrible, heinous crime. Think of the most evil, heinous things you've ever seen on the internet or you've ever read about. That was the future at one point, right? So God knows the molester because God plans the molestation of the molester. Now that's a whole different statement than what I just read earlier when I said God knows the future because he plans the future. But when you take out the word future and you plug in what that future contains, you see the problem? This is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to Calvinistic and predestinarian theology. You have to look at what's under the surface of the words and say, is that really what God's teaching? Does God know the molester will molest because he plans that the molester will molest? No. God can permit evil to run rampant, take his hands off and allow evil to run rampant. Go squander your wealth. Go do what you're going to do and let the chips fall where they may. In other words, God God's wrath is removing his hand of protection and allow sinful people to do what sinful people do, and the consequences unaltered by God. That's what wrath really is all about. God's letting his hand of protection just let people run rampant. And so God is not knowing the future because he's planning what people's future will be, in my estimation, or what they will do. This is the Sproul and MacArthur in their roundtable discussion that we played not long ago. Well, it's been probably 3 or 4 years ago now, so I guess it has been a long time ago. But remember, they said he decrees it. It happens because he decrees it. He knows it. And this is Sproul's exact quote. He knows it because he planned it. He knows it because he decreed it. In other words, God's knowledge is not based upon what he foresees people will choose to do. His knowledge is based upon what he has decreed they will do on true Calvinistic theology. Now, whether Wes would sign off on that, I'm not exactly sure based upon these statements, because they could be taken maybe in different ways. The statement goes on to say the future is the counsel of God. Okay, so again, what is in the future? Molestations, rapes, murders, horrible, heinous crime, torturing. So put that into the word future, take out the word nice, cleaned up word future, take that word out, and put all of those things into that word future and say, the molestations, the rapes, the murders is the counsel of God. You wouldn't want to say that, would you? So you shouldn't say that, even with the nice, more clean vocabulary that sometimes is used and said, okay? I don't believe that everything that's happened throughout our past and into our future is something that is the counsel of God being established. I don't believe that. I believe that there are things going against what he counsels. I think he counsels people not to rape and murder and molest. And so when you see those things happening, they're going against the counsel of God. It's not fulfilling the counsel of God. Okay. It's not going against it's not going according to what he's decreed. Decreed means to declare it, to state it, to say this is true. It's going against what he decreed, just like Jeremiah, the passage that we quote all the time, 19:5, where it says when they're burning their children to Molech, is I did not declare this. I did not decree this. This does not even enter my mind. What he's saying, he's separating what's happening on earth and what they're doing from his counsel and his decree. He's saying, that's not me. That's not from me. That's not what I want. This is why we pray, God, let your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven, because that would be a superfluous prayer if you believe truly that everything is meticulously being done here on earth as God's decreed it to be. And so these kinds of statements are, I think, just sloppy theological statements that do not really represent the counsel and decrees of God as the Bible represents them. The last sentence there, the future is the purpose of God. Again, let's plug in the word take out the word future. The molestations, the rapes, the murders, the Holocaust is the purpose of God being accomplished by God. I disagree with that. God had a purpose in allowing evil men to act freely and to not engage with them, or not to intervene, to allow evil to run rampant. I believe he had a purpose in doing that. But the purpose of rape and murder and molestations is an evil purpose, not God's purpose. There are things that are of God, and there are things that are not of God. There are things that have a godly purpose, and there are things that have an evil purpose. I separate those two. I don't say that just blanket everything is of the purpose of God. I think that's evil. And this is why Calvinism, its biggest critique is it makes God the author of sin. It ultimately puts the blame onto God, and it impugns his character. Heaven forbid we do that. Let's be very careful we don't do that. And again, I'm not necessarily saying Wes would agree with all of the implications of what this statement seems to be saying. I think if we were having a conversation, he might want to nuance it and be very clear that he may not want to say that, okay? I don't know. I'm just going based upon the words here and the way I've seen them used by Piper and other people who have quoted these kinds of things, okay? Let's go on. He quotes from Acts 4:28, which we've covered in many other broadcasts, but this is where it says they carried out, speaking of Pilate and Pontius Pilate and all the others that carried out the crucifixion of Christ, they carried out whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. And this is oftentimes to use as a proof text. See, God predestined the horrible, heinous, sinful actions of those sinful men, and yet God is still just and right and good. Therefore, that gives us the moral qualification, the moral justification to be able to say, God can do that with all things, and you can't still blame God. Now, what we would push back and say, keep in mind that God can predestine something that is freely done, in the sense that he knows they're going to do it and does not intervene to stop it, and uses that evil for a good purpose. That would still be a part of his predestined will and purpose. Just using the same vocabulary that Wes used earlier in that conversation. He permitted it. He allowed it. He knew it was going to happen. He used it for his purpose. That would fit Acts 4 just perfectly. We've used, I know, the sting analogy where police officers know who the criminals are. They know their evil intentions to sell drugs and to do crime. They know about it. They don't cause it. They didn't cause them to become criminals, but they knew about it. And they manipulated them to sell drugs, which is an illegal thing to do, at a certain place and time. So in the sting operation, the police are actually orchestrating a crime, a bad thing, like the selling of Joseph. They're part of organizing and accomplishing that. But notice that the cops are not causing the intentions of the criminals. They know, and they're using the intention of the criminals. In the same way, if mankind can pull that off, if humanity can pull that off, how much more so can God pull that off? I remember when Dr. White engaged with that analogy. He said, doesn't he know how many times sting operations fall apart and they mess up and backfire? And I'm going, well, that's because humanity messes up. But God is perfect in his knowledge and his understanding of things. And so God is not going to mess up in his sting operation. He's going to fulfill it perfectly because he knows the intentions and hearts of the people that he's using in that sting operation. So he knows Pontius Pilate and what he's going to do in certain circumstances. And he uses the evil motives of Pilate and the others, Judas and the others, to accomplish his purpose of redemption. So again, I've said this 1,000 times and I'll continue to say it. Proof that God worked and used evil men to bring about the redemption of sin does not prove that God causes through meticulous decrees all the sin that he worked to redeem. That's just God cleaning up his own mess. Like, I'm going to decree these people to sin so that I can decree the way in which I'm going to redeem their sin. It's just a self-defeating argument, and it's certainly not a biblical basis for that particular philosophical conclusion, in my estimation. Trinity Radio, I'm sure that's Braxton, because Braxton says things like this all the time. No, we all know this is Pritchett. Thanks, Pritchett. He says Leighton just can't handle God getting total control. This is the thing we'll hear a lot from Calvinists. You just can't handle God being sovereign. You just hate God's sovereignty, and that's usually about the best rebuttal they can come up with. Trinity Radio, thank you for the super chat. The next one, Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it whenever he wills. This is a great proof text for my view, because what is there to turn if he's already meticulously controlling everything that the king does and wills to do? If God meticulously decrees everything that this king has been doing since he was a baby, then why would God turn it to do anything other than what he's already decreed it to do? The fact that God intervenes and has the ability to intervene to turn the most powerful human on earth, a king, that were often in those days known to be a deity in the mind of the subjects. These people were all powerful and had all the money and all the control. And what this verse is saying is God can turn the heart of a king just like that. Does that mean that God determines every time that king wants to rape and molest and murder? Obviously not, because that goes against the character and the goodness of God. This is simply a verse that's saying God is more powerful than kings, and he can turn their heart to do whatever he needs them to do whenever he wants them to do it, because he's more powerful than kings. That's just classical theism, has nothing to do specifically with Calvinism or even theistic determinism. Psalm 135, verse 6. Whatever the Lord is pleased, he does in the heavens and in the earth and in the sea and all the deeps. And what if God's pleased to create creatures who have real responsibility and choice? Can he do that? Because if you go down to read verse 16 of that same chapter, folks, you know what it says? The heavenlies belong to the Father, but the earth he's given over to man. Sounds like he's given them some dominion and power, authority, as the New Testament even talks about the authorities and the rulers of this dark age, this world. God has given power and authority to creatures. He has given them the ability to govern and make choices and decisions, because that's what he was pleased to do. And this seems to be the one thing that Calvinists don't believe God can do, even if he's pleased to do it. And I just point to them and go, well, do you believe Psalm 135:6 or not? Because God sits in heaven, does whatever he pleases. If he's pleased to give creatures human free will, libertarian free will, can he? Or is that just too big for God? God couldn't handle that many cajillions, whatever it is, of free will choices. So he has to meticulously determine everything everybody does. Is that what we're saying? I don't think so. There's no other God like God. There's no one like God. He's the unmoved mover. This is again from the quote from the meme here. There's no comparison either in heaven and earth equates to him. Again, we all agree with that. God is unique. He's above us. He's better than us. All of those kinds of things we would obviously sign off on. He goes on down here, the title of the word purposed here. God has the rightful authority, freedom, and wisdom, and the power to bring about everything that he intends to happen. Calvinists, do you believe that? Do you believe that God has the power, authority, and freedom to bring about everything that he intends to happen, even if he intends for men to have libertarian freedom? That's the question you have to ask yourself, because that's the debate. The debate is not whether or not God can do whatever he intends. The debate is whether he intends to create a world of automaton, as C.S. Lewis put it, or a world of actual free moral agents who have genuine choice in the matter. That's the debate. And therefore, it says, everything he intends to come about does come about. Really? What if he intends for free will to come about? What if he intends for people to have real libertarian choice? The ability to either receive or reject the gospel genuinely. What if that's what he intends? Can he do that? Because some, like White and others, have argued that's philosophically, logically impossible for an all-knowing, all-powerful God to create a world with libertarian free creatures. That's the conclusion they've come to. I'm going, you really want to limit God's freedom that much and his power that much, his creative. He's just not powerful and creative enough to create billions of creatures with libertarian freedom. He couldn't handle that, according to that view, I assume. Which means, it says, God plans and governs all things. There is no purposeless events. Now, we've been over this. Matter of fact, there's even an article. Remember y'all making fun of me for saying purposelessness, because I couldn't get that word purposelessness. But we went over this with White, where he'll say either God purposes everything, or there are some things that are without purpose. They're purposeless. And that's a false dilemma, okay? Because God can have a purpose in allowing for libertarian free choice, but that libertarian free choice can have an evil purpose, not a godly purpose, as I explained earlier. So it's not purposeless. It has a purpose. It's an evil purpose. And therefore, it's not of God. It's that simple. Now, God had a purpose in allowing for humans to have their own individual libertarianly free purposes, to do evil things and selfish things. Yeah, there is a purpose in that, but that doesn't mean that the molester who molests did so for God's purpose or a good purpose. God can change it and mold it and redeem it for a good purpose, and we believe that he does do that for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But he's not the one who's purposed it. The evil creature is the one who purposed it for their own evil desires and lusts. It's really not that difficult to understand from our perspective. And when people argue this false dilemma of either everything has God's purpose behind it, or it's purposeless evil. I'm going, folks, otherwise smart individuals are not seeing that there's a third category here of those who have evil purposes versus those who have a godly purpose, and that God in his purposes allow for the freedom to choose which purpose you're going to serve. Again, I don't understand why they think that's a good argument. Providence is the last section there. This is, I think, from the Heidelberg Catechism, from what it sounds like, or maybe a lot of these are from there. I can't tell. It's just a citation there at the bottom. He says, the almighty and everywhere present power. It is in quotes, so I think this is a quote from the Heidelberg Catechism, now that I'm looking at it closely. It says, the almighty is almighty and everywhere present power of God, whereby, as it were, by his hand, he still upholds the heavens and the earth with all creatures, and so governs them. All things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. So instead of just saying all things come not by chance, let's just take the word all things come by his fatherly hand. All things would include every molestation of every infant, every child, every horrible, heinous evil. So every molestation comes by the Father's hand. Do you want to say that? Of course you don't want to say that. But that's what that statement is saying when you play it out truthfully. When you really take the theological diadems and the cool pious language out and you unpack it, all things means all things, unless you mean all sorts of things. Maybe Calvinists, that's the way they're interpreting all things, because that's the way they interpret the word all sometimes. Maybe the people who worded the Heidelberg Confession, maybe they meant all sorts of things come by his hand. That's the best I could possibly imagine that they mean, but I don't think that's what they mean. I think when they say all things, they mean all things, and that means every molestation, rape, murder, horrible, horrible, heinous thing that happens comes by his fatherly hand. God forbid you teach that and believe that. God forbid ever Wes says that clearly to a group of unbelievers on a broadcast that thousands of people watch and listen to. Heaven forbid. I don't think he would. I really don't. Because I think he's more careful than that, and I think he's a lot less consistent in his Calvinism than some are. And so I don't fear that Wes will ever come out and just say things like that to an audience. But when people start getting very clear about their theology, you begin to see where it falls so horrifically short of representing the character and the goodness of God that we even heard Wes defending in that broadcast. So what am I arguing for here? I'm arguing for you to follow Wes's example in defending the goodness and the character of God, even in light of those who question it, by suggesting in any way, shape, or form that he would condemn the innocent. And how much more innocent is anyone than a baby that is murdered in the womb, or an infant that dies? How much more innocent is someone with Down syndrome, for example? How much more innocent is even the person who on Calvinism is born in a condition where they can't understand and respond positively to the things of God because of the nature they have from birth? Because they were created, as Calvin says, doomed from the womb, destined for destruction. As Seth Dillon, I think, rightly argued, what level of moral accountability is that? And why not put the blame back on the creature by saying, no, you know what? They have a God who loves and provides for them, and they're rejecting a God who loves and provides for them. They're not rejecting a God who first rejected them. They're not rejecting a God who created them for destruction. They're not rejecting a God who decreed for them to be born unable to accept the gospel. No, they're rejecting a God who loves and provides and has given everything they need for their salvation. They're walking away from a loving God who wants them. They're not walking away from a God who rejected them and created them for destruction before they were ever born. That's why we have to keep harping on this, and why we have to keep calling out whatever form of Calvinism we're seeing begin to be proffered out there, and just to say, folks, I love you, but the emperor has no clothes. And I know I've referred to that analogy many times before because y'all remembered. It's the gaslighting parable of the people who made this false set of clothes and then mocked people who would even suggest that they can't see that he's wearing in clothes. And that's sometimes the way in which people will engage this conversation is, if Leighton, if you were more holy, if you had more sense about you, if you were more theologically apt, if you really love the Bible the way we do, if you really believed in God's sovereignty and power, if you really had as much pious understanding of who God is as we do, then you would see Calvinism's clothes. You would see that God's, yes, good, his character is good, even though he's condemning for people who have absolute no control over their choices and behaviors and actions, ultimately. I'm sorry, brothers, but until God determines me to accept determinism, I'm just going to continue to harp on the fact that it's not a biblical theological concept, and it undermines the character and the goodness of God, and it hurts our witness to the lost world that needs to see the goodness of God and his character as represented through the person of Jesus Christ. As I said at the beginning of the program, thank you for those who give on a regular basis. Thanks for those who have purchased the book. I just looked up and there's 777 viewers right now. I just thought that was I just saw 777. It's better than seeing the 666 on. I saw 777. So praise God for that. And I just want to thank those that you've viewed these programs, you've sharing these programs. I'm beginning to get calls and emails and things from people who are seeing this broadcast from just the most remote parts of the world. And it's just baffling to me how it's affecting and impacting some people's lives. Even one example of a person in the Philippines who had gotten a copy of my book, who had adopted Calvinistic theology and was really struggling and about to leave his faith, and talked about how his book, the book just really answered some questions for him and really just kind of redirected his trajectory in his own sanctification. And just the stories like that are just so encouraging to hear. And that person got that book from one of you listeners, who had ordered the book and gave it to him because they knew that they were struggling with it. I cannot begin to say thank you enough for those who are willing to get. Somebody accused me on Twitter when I posted something about Wes, and saying, "Hey, brother, I'd love to discuss this with you." And the first accusation out of their mouth was, "Oh, you're just trying to." I can't remember exactly the way he said it. Rift off his audience, or steal from his audience, or get his audience, or something like that. Like you're just trying to get a bigger audience. And my immediate reaction was to say, "Oh, I'm not either. That's not my desire." And then I started thinking about it, and I go, you know what? Yeah, it kind of is. Yeah, I would love to have Wes's audience. And then I started thinking about, why do I want Wes's audience? And I was self-examining. Why do I want Wes's audience? I can honestly say to you, I want them to know of the goodness of God's character and his love for all people. That's why I started this. When I started this broadcast, for years, there was no monetization of stuff. There was no patron donors to help make this what it's become and have the resources that we have, this cool microphone and all that thing. I had a little $30 microphone. I think I still got it right down here. At use. And what motivated me to do that back then is the same thing that's motivated me to do it today. I want people to understand what God has taught me through my journey out of Calvinism and seeing the glory and the goodness and the love of our God. That's been my motivation from the beginning of this broadcast, and I know it's my heart today. And I want those of you who stand with me on this to recognize and to realize that if we're going to have a theological impact upon our Calvinistic brothers and sisters, we've got to show them love and respect and realize that just like I was when I was a Calvinist for 10 years of my life, I was not a Satanist, God-hating baby killer, okay? Some of, unfortunately, you all treat Calvinists online. I recognize some of you feel a lot more strongly than I do about the salvation of Calvinists and whether they're saved or not, all those kinds of things. But trust me when I say this, as the Proverbs says, you're going to win more, my own paraphrase in modern day vernacular, you're going to win more flies with honey than vinegar. With the sweetness of speech comes persuasion, is the way the proverb puts it. If you show love and respect, you're going to get more people listening to you because you're willing to engage with them where they are and understand where they're coming from. I also get a lot of accusations about just, oh, how dare you just bring accusation against the brethren, and you should support Wes for what he's doing. Look at all he's doing. As if I can't chew gum and walk at the same time. Yeah, I can both show a lot of love and respect for what Wes is doing, tell him I love him, respect him, want him to keep doing what he's doing, but also say, hey, brother, you know that meme you put out, that affirmation that you said about this, and this, have you considered some of these other views? Have you thought about some of these other things? Here's some things that I've studied that maybe help you to see it from a different perspective. What's wrong with that? I don't think there's anything wrong with brothers confronting other brothers in love with respect and just saying, I want you to understand God's character and his love and his provision for all people in the way that he's presumably brought me to understand and love him. And that is definitely the motivation here. I wanted to make sure Trinity Radio, I already thanked for your super chat. Prudence McFrugal, thank you for your super chat. He says, have you read Adam Clark's? Yes, I've read Adam Clark's commentary. Specifically on Acts 4:27, I don't remember. He says there is a parenthesis, and it's Jesus's actions that God determined, not the actions of men. Okay, I'd not read that. I highly respect Adam Clark and his commentary. You read that guy's resume, and we'll talk about a guy who knew his languages. My goodness. Adam Clark has some really good commentary. Matter of fact, if you're looking for good commentary online that's free, look up Adam Clark's commentary. It's a good one to look at. I don't agree with, obviously, all of his commentary on every single point, but there's a lot of it that's really good if you're looking at it this year. I say this year because I was reading something from Ryan there. Are you going to ETS? This is usually, Ryan, when I end up signing up to go to ETS, is when someone like you says, hey, are you going to ETS? And I think to myself, I wonder when ETS is, because I haven't thought about it in a year. But I always have such a good time seeing, friends and, colleagues and people from, I always run into Mike Winger and other guys that catch up with. Ruslan was there last year, and Mike was there, and well, I don't want to mispronounce names or say the wrong name, but there's about 4 or 5 others I'm thinking of guys I've had on my program or I've engaged with on my program that I've run into at the ETS meetings, and it's always a lot of fun to have these conversations with these guys. And so the going to the individual breakout conferences is not always the goal for me, at least whenever I go to those kinds of things. Joe Koretko is presenting. And Adam Harwood presents almost all the time. And I always go to Adam's breakout sessions when he has one, at least most of the time I do. But I didn't know Joel was presenting. So I'm sure he's presenting something on Septuagint or something that he's really good in, that's kind of his main focus. But I've come to love Joel too. So I need to look it up and find out the dates for it and the location for it this year and see if I can make that happen, because that would be a lot of fun. And for those of you, the 825 who are now listening, who can go, find me and say hi. I would love to see you. It's always a great kind of reunion for folks to get together and do something. Someone made a suggestion that, since a lot of guys are getting together for the ETS and doing something for the ETS, you should do something for provisionists, like have a provisionist party or do some kind of after party or lunch or dinner or something like that. And I always tell people, I'm always like, okay, you want to coordinate that? So I'll show up. But if you're looking to me to be a coordinator, you ask people who know me very well. I'm not really good with details and coordination of things. And so if any of you are gifted in that area and you want to coordinate and plan an event for us provisionist folks, I would include the Armenians in that umbrella, by the way. And to say, hey, you want to get together? Let's all get together, have a theological fun discussion, invite one Calvinist to pick on, like Keith Fauske or someone like that, have him come in and we'll just pick on him. So that would be a lot of fun. I would really look forward to that. So, all right. Well, I appreciate the comments, the questions. Yeah. There's Warren right there saying, let's schedule it in the Southeast. Yeah. He wants to get closer to home. That's right. That's good stuff. All right, brothers and sisters, as I always say, I'm going to declare the end from the beginning, because I knew from the very beginning I was going to say this at the end. Go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.